So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Shelley James, and I'm passionate about lighting for health and well-being, and the way that lighting affects people in residential care is something that I have been passionate about for a while. And so what we've done today is to bring together scientists leading the field, and then we're going to take a brief break. And then we've got 3 amazing healthcare providers who are going to talk about that. And then at the end, for those who want to stay, are going to have a conversation chaired by Helen Looms with a couple of the healthcare providers. So without any further ado, I'm going to welcome Professor Russell Foster to the stage. Russell is sort of the godfather of all of this. And he's currently speaking to us from the Royal Society in London, where he is sort of chairing a panel on light and pollution and sound pollution. So Russell, if you'd be willing to turn your camera on, and then we can begin.
Okay, Shelley, thank you so much. I'm going to try and share my screen. Or can you activate my screen?
It's set up so that everybody can.
Okay, so oh, there we go. I think is that it? No, I can't see the normal icon of screen sharing.
Green one at the bottom.
Yeah. Oh, hang on. Maybe it's there it is. Got it. Got it. Looking in the wrong place. Excellent. So hopefully everybody can see this. I'll go to full screen if that's the case. Wonderful. Okay, super. I'll just then reduce that and then we can get going. Well, Shelley, thank you so much for the opportunity of a very short introduction to this important meeting about innovations in healthcare. What I thought I could do is provide a framework to think about healthcare. And the sort of theme I wanted to explore with everybody was multi-morbidity. And let me unpack that in a little bit more detail. So multi-morbidity, as many of you will know, is defined as the co-occurrence of 2 or more chronic conditions. And so we're probably all aware of common comorbid conditions, of course, heart disease, hypertension, respiratory disease, mental health problems, including dementia, cerebrovascular disease, joint disease, diabetes, and sensory impairments, and also within that context, notably balance. And multimorbidity has been estimated to affect up to 95% of primary care, of the primary care population, aged 65 years and older. And what we mean by primary care, of course, is the first point of contact in the healthcare system. And this is sort of an illustration of how age and multimorbidity are linked. So we see on the vertical axis low age to high age, and on the x-axis low multimorbidity to high multimorbidity. And so you often see this sort of relationship whereby as you age, the chances, the risk of multimorbidity increases. Now, of course, we can add a third dimension to this, which is you can talk about risk modifiers, and we can show here low to high risk modifiers. So, for example, if you have a low risk modifier, you can be of high age, but have a low risk of multimorbidity. Medium risk, of course, intermediate levels between age and multimorbidity. And of course, if you have high risk factors, then you're going to be fairly young and yet still have high levels of multimorbidity. And so what we clearly want to do in the healthcare sector is, and I should do that again because I quite like that animation, is go from high risk modifiers to implement low risk modifiers so that as we age, we reduce the risk of multimorbidity. Now, what are the modifiable risk factor targets to change the trajectory of multimorbidity? And of course, my pet topic would be sleep and circadian rhythm disruption. And so we can just sort of put this into some sort of context. And this is a fairly recent, it's a 2022 paper which I urge you to look at. And I've extracted a few sentences from this. And one is data from almost 8,000 Britons followed for 25 years show that healthy 50-year-olds are more likely to go on and develop multimorbidity if they get only 5 hours of sleep a night, an element of sleep and circadian rhythm disruption. People who had 5 hours or less of sleep from the age of 50 were 30% more likely to be diagnosed with numerous chronic diseases over the lifespan of 25 years than those who slept 7 hours. And then finally, 60-year-olds who slept 5 hours or less had a 32% greater chance, while 70-year-olds who had only 5 hours sleep at night had a 40% elevated risk when compared to those who had more sleep. So there's very nice and strong correlations between increased multimorbidity and at least in one element of SCARD, which is reduced sleep duration. And of course, there will be others. I mean, if we were talking about shift work, of course, we'd factor that in and see even more dramatic results. So the consequences, of course, of sleep and circadian rhythm disruption, which have been well documented, are as follows. So there's an increased risk of cognitive impairment, impaired emotional responses, cardiovascular disease, stroke, altered stress responses, lowered immunity, infection, cancer, metabolic abnormalities, type 2 diabetes, depression and psychosis, and of course dementia. And critically, all of these conditions are commonly components of multimorbidity. So let's return to this diagram here, whereby we're looking at age versus multimorbidity. And rather than just having a generic risk factor, let's now look at the relationship with the third, with sleep and circadian rhythm disruption risk. And the point I want to make is that if you can minimize sleep and circadian rhythm disruption, you can reach high age with low multimorbidity, intermediate SCARD, and then of course high SCARD, higher rates of multimorbidity. And again, what we want to do is shift from a high SCARD to a low SCARD state to lower multimorbidity with increased age. And so what are the sorts of ways in which we can modify SCARD, sleep and circadian rhythm disruption? Well, as you'll hear throughout the following presentations, of course, light can be very powerful, nutrition, exercise, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. There are new drugs which we're working on in Oxford, and there will be other examples. But that's the sort of way I'd like to sort of present a way of thinking about the impact of sleep and circadian rhythm disruption on age and multimorbidity risk. Now, in terms of proof of concept, what we've done in Oxford, led by Dan Freeman, was CBTI, and in this case is digital CBTI, and mental health. And so this is a study which looked at individuals showing insomnia, showing paranoia and hallucinatory experiences. And I'm only going to show the paranoia. So you see the paranoia on the vertical axis here. And in the control group, there was no intervention. So we see the levels of paranoia before and after. And we see, no great surprise, that they are not statistically different. Now we're going to look at the experimental group who had cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia delivered digitally. And this is the level of paranoia prior to the intervention, and this is the level of paranoia post-intervention. And so we get a highly significant reduction in paranoia, and of course that corresponded with a reduction in insomnia in these individuals, and paranoia mirrored hallucinatory experiences. So simply by addressing sleep and circadian rhythm disruption, you could actually have a positive impact upon mental health. And of course, there are lots of other examples we could think of in this domain. Okay, so in the last few minutes, what's needed? In my view, this would be the framework to think about what's needed. And so we have in the research domain, mouse models. We can go from genotype to phenotype. We've got human clinical studies. And then we have therapeutic interventions, such as light and drugs and CBTI and other factors. We need two more elements, which is measures of SCARD. So if we're going to try and target SCARD, we need to actually measure how effective we are at reducing, for example, insomnia. And of course, critically, I think for all of us, there's an educational component whereby we can actually deliver the knowledge generated to the broader community in terms of engagement and training in the area of SCARD and multimorbidity. These are linked in the following ways, of course, whereby a fundamental mechanistic understanding could inform human clinical studies and vice versa. Observations from the clinic can allow us to design better experiments to look at mechanisms in mouse models. We can test mouse models with our therapeutic interventions. And of course, we can use those therapeutic interventions to measure empirically what's going on in the human realm. In terms of technology, we need, of course, measures of sleep and circadian rhythm disruption, both in mice, humans, and to look at the impact of our therapeutic interventions. And no great surprise, education impacts upon all of these areas. Of course, we want to get, if we're going to get sort of studies, we want to reach the maximum audience as possible so that we can improve the health status of individuals. Okay, I think that's a useful way of thinking about the interactions of what's needed. And just my last slide would be, I think the time is right. I think we've got laboratory studies in place. We've got clinical studies in place. We finally have engagement by government. Some of you will have heard about the fact that Stuart and I have been speaking today to a House of Lords inquiry on light pollution and noise pollution in the sector. And also we have finally academic, health, charity and industrial collaborations. And a lovely example of that is what we're doing in Oxford with the WCS Care and trying to modify the light in the nursing home environment to improve SCARD and improve overall health, mental status and well-being. So I think the time is right. The second point I would make, though, is that we must not oversell. We're dealing with complex and dynamic biological systems, and therapeutics to reduce SCARD are likely to have different effects on different individuals. One size will not fit all. And I think we need to bear this in mind very much as we go through with our studies. And then finally, I think we need genuine partnerships. It's critical to have an honest, transparent dialogue between scientists, engineers, manufacturers and end users about solutions and problems. I think it's very wrong to go and say, we want to prove this hypothesis. No, we want to go in and test whether a potential intervention is going to have an effect or not. And so with those few reflections, I'd like to finish and hand back to Shelley. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Stuart, very much indeed. That was a great.
That was Russell. I know he's brilliant, but he's not omnipotent.
Oh dear me, sorry, too tense here. Good to see you, Russell. Thank you again, and yeah, and welcome to all the people who have joined in the last few minutes. That was Professor Russell Fuster setting the context for this conversation. We're going to have 3 scientists now speaking about their work, which is fulfilling some of the things that Russell has been talking about just now. And then we're going to take a brief break before we speak to some amazing healthcare providers who are just showing us exactly that it isn't one size fits all. So first, we're going to talk. Shadab Rahman has kindly agreed to, all the way from the States, is going to be telling us a little bit about his work, which has had a dramatic effect on falls. I'm going to put Professor Shadab Rahman's details in the chat so that you can find him rather than me talking about it, because we've got a lot to carry through. So thank you very much indeed, Shadab. I will turn my camera off now.
Thank you, Dr. Shelley James. It's a privilege to be here, and especially following Dr. Russell Foster. I echo everything that he said. I will be presenting some of the work that we've done in a few different settings related to clinical care, and starting off with a recent study that we completed looking at the impact of upgraded lighting on falls in care home residents. I have a few disclosures, so I'll just give you a minute, but nothing directly related to the work that I'm doing today or presenting today. Okay, so in a survey back in the 80s, it was shown that we spend about 90% of our day indoors. And obviously, when we're indoors, we are illuminating the area primarily for vision so that we're safe. But that has created a problem, which is our built environment in contrast to the natural environment that we have evolved to. So typically, in a daytime setting, we are exposed to about 300 photopic lux in an office setting, for example. And at nighttime, indoor intensities are around 50 to 100 photopic lux. But if you compare it to what we have evolved to, what our physiological system responds to, in the daytime, we would be exposed to about 10,000 lux of light, whereas at nighttime, we're done at about less than 1 lux. So essentially, we have changed the contrast between night and day by orders of magnitude. And we've created this problem where we have dim days and bright nights. We know from various different studies, both in the laboratory as well as in the field, that visible light exposure induces a wide range of physiologic responses in humans and animals. From gene expression to protein expression, changes in hormone levels. Perhaps all of you have heard about how light affects melatonin. It suppresses melatonin at night, but there are various other hormones, cortisol, reproductive hormones that are altered by light exposure, and then all the way up to overt behavior. And there are various different names that we give to these responses, but they can be broadly classified as non-visual responses to light exposure. But again, these are physiologic responses that are happening with exposure to visible light. So how do we overcome this problem? And the objective is rather simple. We need to go back to the sort of contrast that we had, that we evolved to, essentially have brighter days and dimmer nights. And I would like to stress, and Professor Foster has touched on this, and I'm very grateful for that, we must have evidence-based interventions. We can't just pull things out of the hat and say, oh, I think this will work, and then we just throw it in there. We have to have hypotheses and test hypotheses. And I love what Dr. Foster said, which is, we can't go in there to prove a hypothesis. We have to test the hypothesis. And so our interventions must be based on evidence. And over the last few decades, we have collected a lot of data, again, both in controlled laboratory studies as well as in applied field settings, where we have tested different characteristics of light exposure. For example, wavelength, the spectrum, the intensity, the duration, pattern, timing, history, etc. And we have a fairly good working understanding of how these different characteristics affect physiology. And so we can take that understanding and develop protocols and intervention to improve overall health and well-being. And so something that, a very, very simplified guiding principles that we use for designing interventions, we essentially dichotomize the objective. Again, as Professor Foster says, it's not one size fits all. So depending on the situation, if you're designing lighting interventions for environments where people are not sleeping, and it's primarily designed for work and performance, you want to have high intensity blue and rich lighting, essentially giving a stronger melanopic input to the system. Whereas if you have an environment where people will be sleeping as well as working, so for example, care homes, then you want to have a tunable system, and I'll put tunable in quotes, because it doesn't have to necessarily be a very fancy system. Essentially, all you want is the lighting intensity and the spectrum to be changing throughout the day so that it better matches the physiology that we have. So with that very simple model in mind, I'll jump into a few applications that we've recently tested, starting with falls in care homes. So falls in older adults is a major concern. It's a health concern, it's a psychological concern, and it's a burden not only for the care providers, the economy at large, but also for the individual going forward. So 1 in 4 adults fall each year, at least in the US. And then older adults, it costs a lot. It costs about $50 billion per year. And then it leads to 3 million emergency ED visits per year. And in the last decade alone, the rate of falls have increased by about 30%. So It's a major concern in the aging population. And there are multiple risk factors that are associated with falls. And so typically, if you want to do an intervention to reduce falls, it has to be a multi-component intervention. And various different interventions have been tried and tested. So, patient education, changes in lifestyle, changes in environment, and often changes in environment do include changes in the lighting environment so that people can see better. But often these interventions are broad and complex, and there are many, when you try to actually implement them, there are many barriers that come up. So can a passive intervention, such as implementing a dynamic lighting schedule, work? And that was the hypothesis that we tested. So we know that lighting interventions affect various different risk factors associated with falls. So for example, lighting interventions improve sleep. It improves the duration and quality of sleep. It improves mood. It improves activity and cognition. And these are all independent risk factors for fall. So we essentially asked the question, can lighting interventions, specifically implementing a dynamic lighting schedule, improve fall risk in care home residents? And the way we did this study, we worked with 4 different care homes, a pair from each company, and we collected data for 12 months before the intervention occurred. And then post-intervention, we collected another 12 months of data. And the way we did the interventions was that in each pair of care homes, there was 1 control site and 1 experimental site. And so that gives us in total 2 experimental sites and 2 control sites. And just to give you a background on the demographic of the population, so pre-lighting upgrade, the control sites and the experimental sites were very similar, mean age of around 83, 53% or so women, and then the level of dementia was similar, or the prevalence of dementia was similar between both populations. And then also post-lighting upgrade, by and large, they were similar, except for dementia, there was a significant increase in dementia in the experimental site. It's just that the population was slightly different. It's not that the lighting caused the dementia. So nonetheless, what was our lighting upgrade? The control conditions essentially had static lighting schedules. So in other words, from midnight to midnight, the lighting levels never changed. And if you look at the photopic lux, that's the solid line here, it's around 150 photopic lux all throughout the day, the 24-hour day. And if you look at the melanopic intensity, melanopic EDI, it's close to around 70 melanopic EDI. And then, so this is in the common areas. And in the bedrooms, you see much lower lighting levels, photopic lux of around 70 to 80 melanopic lux all throughout the day. And then, so the experimental condition, essentially what we tried to do was create dimmer nights and brighter days. And so you can see this graduated change that occurs throughout the day. And we're using standard off-the-shelf, readily available commercial products, nothing special, 3000 Kelvin blue depleted lamps for the evenings and night, and 6500 Kelvin blue enriched lamps for the LED lamps for the daytime. And that's, you can see the dynamic change in the common areas as well as in the bedroom. And by and large, so what we did was we increased the lighting levels during the day by about 73% in the common areas and about 65% in the bedrooms. And at night, we decreased it about 83% in the common areas and 33% in the bedrooms. So now, what was the impact of this on the primary outcome, which was falls? So before the lighting upgrade, you can see that the rate of falls were very similar between the control and experimental sites. And they were very close to the US average. So about 7 falls or 6.8 falls per 1,000 patient days. Now, following the lighting intervention, you see a significant reduction in the number of falls or the rate of falls in the experimental sites, and a slight but not statistically significant increase in the rate of falls in the control sites. And what this amounts to is that there was a 43% reduction in the risk of falls following the lighting intervention in the experimental sites compared to the control sites. So these results were very encouraging from the fall perspective. But then we also had Pacific Northwestern Laboratories in association with the Department of Energy in the US do their own independent assessment of the energy savings that resulted from this lighting intervention. So the conversion from standard fluorescent to LEDs. And essentially they reported that by and large, there was about 60 to 70% reduction in energy usage by switching over to these LED. And you can see the breakdown in the component of just from the amount of energy savings from LED conversion versus what's coming from, you know, the additional savings that comes from the dynamic schedule where you're dimming the LEDs in the evening. And you can see this full report, which is published online. So what we find essentially, it's a win-win situation. You're improving the rate of fault from patient outcomes perspective, but also from the facility side, you're having major savings in energy. Okay, I want to switch gears slightly and look at another study, because you know the primary outcome for that study was patient outcome. But what about the providers? So we did another study where we focused on medical errors. And in this case, you know, medical errors are of concern, again, to the economy as well as to the patient, obviously, but also to the institution and the care providers. So it's very expensive, as I said, but more importantly, it's associated, at least in the US, with about 200,000 deaths annually and over 1 million injuries due to medical errors. And we and others obviously have done a lot of work showing that you know, sleep is a major component. Lack of sleep, I should say, is a major component or a risk factor for increasing errors in medical errors in care providers. So this was a study done with the University Hospital, with the University of Wisconsin. And in this particular trial, what we did was we changed the lighting in just the nursing stations and looked at the impact on, or examined the impact on medical errors. So it was a single site study, 6 months with a 6-month baseline and then 6 months immediately following the lighting intervention. So initially there were fluorescent lighting, and then we changed them out with LEDs, and the lights were essentially, we went from 61 melanopic EDI during the evening shift to 208 melanopic EDI in the, also during the evening shift. And we collected medical errors from 1,073 ICU admissions, 5 months per condition. And over those 1,073 admissions, there were a total of 302 errors. When we analyzed the difference in the error rates between the two, what we found was there was a 6% reduction in medical errors, which did not reach statistical significance. Neither the potential errors, but there was a 10% reduction in potential errors, 13% reduction in harmful errors. However, there was a statistically significant reduction of 33% in high severity harmful errors. So taking the two sites together, implementing lighting interventions, a dynamic lighting schedule for the residents who are sleeping and active in the care homes, you see a reduction in the rate of fault. And then if you specific lighting intervention for the care providers, which is not dynamic, because again, like I said at the start, we want to keep things simplified and to maximize alertness and proactivity and safety for the workers. We want to keep them active at night, and therefore we're just increasing the melanopic content of the light and giving them brighter blue and rich light during the night shift. And we see that there's a significant reduction in medical errors as well. Okay, I just want to quickly touch on my last study, which is to show that, you know, this can be done in residential settings as well. So again, this was a lighting intervention study of dynamic lighting schedule in a residential setting where patients with mild traumatic brain injury were being treated with the standard lighting that they had in their homes versus implementing a dynamic lighting schedule. And I want to point out again that the dynamic lighting schedule was created very simply using off-the-shelf product where we weren't putting in fancy controllers or anything like that. It was, you know, you either have a dim table lamp with blue depleted lighting that you would turn on during the day, during the evening, whereas you would have brighter lights just coming from your, you know, overhead lighting or other lamps in your room. So a very simplistic approach. It was a crossover design, so a small pilot trial with only 24 individuals, and but essentially they had a baseline, then they did treatment with the dynamic schedule, or they had a control and then a follow-up, and in the reverse sequence for the second group. So again, just to highlight the difference, I'll just focus on the melanopic EDI. The control condition was pretty high to begin with, but nonetheless, we made it higher with the treatment during the daytime. And in the evening, you see the major change where you're going from a high melanopic EDI in the control condition to a lower melanopic EDI in the evening. What are the outcomes? We assessed sleep quality essentially with the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. This is a questionnaire that individuals can fill out and they can report their sleep quality, and a lower score indicates an improvement. And so we see that with the implementation of the dynamic schedule, there is an improvement in sleep quality. And then once you take the lighting intervention away, because remember, this is a crossover design, you can see that you lose that improvement in sleep quality, and in fact, it gets worse over time during the follow-up. The other measure that we had was the Insomnia Severity Index, and this is a measure that's used clinically as well to assess insomnia severity, how bad a patient is experiencing their insomnia. And again, you can see that with the lighting intervention, there's a significant reduction in their ISI score, so in their insomnia severity. And then once you take the lighting intervention away, their insomnia severity worsens. So essentially, these are three examples where you can use lighting interventions, which are implemented based on evidence, but more importantly, content and context specific manners, and you can see improvements in health outcomes. So just to finish off, I think, again, Professor Foster has touched on this, and I agree with him that the timing is right, and there are various different opportunity spheres for us to test this and optimize these different lighting interventions. There's obviously the residential setting where we can look at outcomes such as sleep and circadian health and overall well-being. But similarly, we can test this in the commercial settings and in the clinical settings. All of these are very attractive avenues for testing. However, I want to, as Dr. Foster did, I want to stress that we do need to test them because we want evidence-based interventions. I'd like to thank a whole host of individuals, my colleagues, my institutions, and the funding agencies. And I'll leave you with a simple proverb that says, when you shut out the sun from coming through the window, the doctor comes out at the door. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shadab. That was absolutely, wow, you packed a lot in. I'm really glad that we're recording this so that people can listen again and read again. We had a great question in the chat, which I'd be grateful if you can have a think about, potentially share that information either in the chat, or we'll be getting back in touch with our guests with any questions that they have to follow up after this conversation, because it's so dense. I'm going to pass it forward now to Elizabeth, who is kindly speaking to us from Norway, who is in from Bergen. I'm going to post Elizabeth's details in the chat so that you can find her, but she's going to tell us a little bit about the acute alerting effects of light, whereas you've just been speaking so fascinatingly about some longer term ones. So over to you now, Elizabeth. Thank you all again.
Thank you, Shelley. Can you guys hear me all right?
Perfect.
Yeah. That's good. So thank you for the introduction, Shelley, and also for putting together this this great meeting here today. Today I'm going to introduce the ongoing project called nLight. So it's exploring new and optimal light conditions to improve cognition, mood, and health in people with dementia. So it's quite a tall order there. So my name is Elizabeth, and I work at the University of Bergen, Norway, at a place called Alrek Health Hub, which is a new and exciting place where we join forces from different disciplines to improve, especially primary health care related health problems. Before I introduce the Enlight project and the very preliminary findings related to emotional processing in state from that project, I also shortly wish to introduce our last research project called the Demlight trial, as this project in many ways both informed and inspired the ongoing Enlight project. So our main hypothesis in the Demlight trial, which started in 2017, was that light therapy can improve circadian rhythms, sleep, and behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia in nursing home patients. So very quickly now, Demlight was a cluster randomized trial recruiting 78 nursing home patients from 8 different nursing home units as clusters. And as you see, similar to what you saw in the last talk as well, what we really tried to do was improving light with a bright light midday and more blue depleted lower intensity light in the morning and in the evening and night. So this project went on for the 24 weeks of winter here in Norway. And I will keep it brief. So what we did find was a significant improvement in sleep in the intervention group as compared to the control group. Meanwhile, the result was found when sleep was observed by the nursing staff who knew the participants well, not by actigraphy. I'm not going to go into why we think that happened, but we also looked at the behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia, mainly looking at the neuropsychiatric inventory. And we saw a significant improvement in the total score, but surprisingly, this rather sizable change did not remain significant after the correction for multiple testing. Meanwhile, there was a significant effect of light on the affective, so that is mood symptoms, subsyndrome of that scale, both with and without the FDR correction. And also when we did analysis with the Cornell scale for depression in dementia, we found a significant improvement in depression, both in the total scores and in the mood-related signs subscales. So looking at circadian outcomes in this study, analyzing rest activity rhythms from actigraphs, we found a significant difference in the groups in acrophase shift from baseline to midwinter. And interestingly, the control group mean phase was delayed by about 1 hour compared to the intervention group, which remained relatively stable throughout the winter. So this was a significant result, but it did not remain after the FDR corrections. So the main outcome really to improve in this study was the mood-related symptoms. As always, there's many things that we, in hindsight, think we should have done differently in this study, but relevant for today's talk is that the design made it difficult to ascertain what aspects of the light intervention and what mechanisms that were most important for the improvements. So is the most important changes related to acute effects of light or more long-term improvement in circadian rhythms and sleep? So interestingly, the strongest finding was not related to either circadian rhythms or sleep, but to the affective or mood-related symptoms. And these findings and also lessons learned were the basis for the ongoing Enlight project, where we want to look closer on the immediate effects of light on alertness, cognitive performance, and emotional state. So here you see the core group at the University of Bergen. We are currently hiring another PhD candidate who is hopefully starting up this month. So this is good news. And today I'll focus on the second work package, as you see here, and objectives in the Enlight project. So the testing of the acute effects of different light modalities, which was both mono and polychromatic light, on emotion recognition and processing. So we are currently working on a review on this subject, and what we see from the 53 included papers is that there are very few studies on the processing of emotional stimuli in relation to different light modalities, and there are even fewer studies including older adults or people with dementia. So there's a need for looking into this. Thus far, we have mainly included young adults with 30 participants included thus far, aiming for 40 in total. We have just started to include healthy older adults and people with dementia. So this is going to be exciting. Regardless of the group allocation, all participants are screened according to cognitive function and mental health. And they are assessed at baseline in terms of intelligence, cognitive function, personality, chronotype, physical activity, alexithymia, and also they are monitored with actigraphs and sleep diary 1 week prior to and also during the experiment. The latter measurements is to ensure that the participants are have kept a sound bed routine the week prior to testing, allowing them to get enough sleep before arriving at the lab at 8 in the morning. So here you see an example of the complete experimental protocol. The order of light conditions are randomized, as are the order of tests during the experiment. So the experiment spans over 4 days, testing the participants on Tuesdays and Wednesdays over a 2-week period. And before coming to the lab, the participants are instructed to wear these goggles, as you see here, in an attempt to minimize prior light exposure. They also will remain in dim light 1 hour at the lab before the light exposure start, and the subsequent testing commences. So the cognitive tests that we include in this experiment is the psychomotor vigilance task, attempting to measure alertness or vigilance. We have the NVAC tests, we have the flanker task, and we also monitor the heart rate throughout the experiments, allowing us to investigate the effects on heart rate variability. So diving into the emotional processing. All the tests were based on the faces database, allowing us to randomly select a high number of different faces and expressions balanced for age and gender. And the participants are tested on these 3 tasks: explicit emotion recognition, implicit emotion recognition, and an emotional go, no-go task. So I'm just showing you an example here of the explicit emotion recognition task, where we ascertain the participants' time to respond to the stimuli, the reaction time, and also to which degree they are correct in their impression of the facial expression they are seeing. They are also asked to rate the intensity of the expressed emotion. So in the explicit task, they are allowed to watch or look at the face for as long as they want to, whereas in this implicit task, the facial expression is just briefly flashed on the screen, and the participants are then asked to choose what expression they think the face might have had. And also here we measure reaction time and accuracy, whether or not they are right. To the go, no-go tests. This is the results I will report today. And this is also used both with and without emotional expressions. So in the regular go, no-go tests, it's mainly testing response inhibition, whereas the emotional go, no-go tests also attempts to measure processing of emotional stimuli, and it also is said to measure emotional regulation to some extent. So in the InLight trial, the emotional go-no tasks consisted of 2 blocks with 64 trials each. In 1 block, the participants are asked to press a button when they see a happy face and not press a button when they see a sad face. So for instance, here you would press the button, not press the button, and then press the button. The opposite is the case in the other block. And this is a task that is kind of swift and is considered difficult for many participants. So errors do occur. And the main outcomes are reaction times, and incorrect versus correct responses, which may, among others, uncover biases towards positive or negative emotions. So the preliminary results from the emotional go-no-go task, looking at the response time. And I want to emphasize that this is very fresh and preliminary results from the experiment. As expected, the mean age for now is rather young, in the early 20s, as most of the participants this far has been bachelor level university students.
I'm sorry, I'm just really aware of the time. So
Yeah, I thought I had 15 minutes. Sorry.
Yes, that's, yeah, we're coming up to that. So yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Go
okay.
ahead.
It says 11 minutes here. I will be quick.
Oh, I'm
then.
sorry, my mistake.
So the results from the repeated measures analysis showed that there was a significant effect of valence, meaning that there was a shorter response time to positive as compared to negative stimuli. So this is quite common. And we have also found a difference between red and dim light with an LSD correction, but not when correcting for multiple comparisons. So looking at the repeated measure analysis, we also found a significant effect of valence with short response times to positives as compared to negative stimuli, as I said, but we also found a difference between red and dim light. You can see here, looking at the interaction between light and emotional valence, that we did see that there were significantly shorter reaction times to positive, seen here in the blue line, as compared to the negative emotional expression, again confirming the bias. But we also see the tendency to a significant interaction effect between the light condition and valence. Although only a potential trend with a p-value of 0.6 between the red and dim light, there were where the negative stimuli compared to the positive stimuli had an even longer response time in red as compared to the dim light. So what now? The overall positive bias validated our protocol, as this is what we expected. Humans are generally more inclined towards happy faces. And as I have emphasized, these results are really preliminary. But in a pilot study looking at the response time for the psychomotor vigilance task, we discovered that the participants were not conscientious in keeping a sound bed routine, allowing them to be fully rested when arriving at our lab at 8 in the morning. So in future analysis, we will also add total sleep time. And also we, of course, will look at not only the go-no-go task, but also other emotional processing tasks and outcome. And I'm also particularly excited to investigate further the effects of emotional processing also in older adults and people with dementia. So a significant finding here revealing differences in, for example, processing of negative and positive stimuli according to light conditions could indicate that the light acutely changes emotional state. So taking longer to process negative stimuli in red as compared to, for instance, dim light could suggest the bias away from negative stimuli in the red light condition, which is also something to consider when designing the light conditions in, for instance, nursing homes. And it's also interesting from a clinical perspective, considering the prior and ongoing research we do here in Norway, looking at the effects of blue depleted light on bipolar disorder and also agitation in people with dementia. So I was trying to run through the latest parts here, but this is some images from our light lab. And with that, I thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm sorry, we're just aware of such a packed program. It's fascinating work, and very much looking forward to seeing where we go with that. So if people want to read that paper in more detail, is it published yet?
No, this is preliminary, as I said. So this is, I think it's more fun to introduce that than to introduce all data. But the prior study is all published, so that the effects in the nursing home is possible to read online. Yes.
Right. So it's hot off the press, and it sounds as though lighting can really affect emotional reactions. So that's a really fascinating thing to discover. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm now going to move on swiftly because we're about 8 minutes late, but I know that's how these things run. Thank you again. I know that you ended up starting a bit late, so forgive us. I'm going to now pass over to Stuart, and Elizabeth's details are in the chat also if you want to get back in touch with her, and if you can post that paper in the chat as well, that'd be great, Elizabeth. Okay, over to Stuart, who doesn't normally look so posh. He's been in the
Not
house
usually so
a while.
tidy. Yeah.
Over to you. So Stuart's going to talk a little bit.
Have you got your?
I'm off. Yeah.
You need to see your sound off. As well, not your. Hang on.
The boys are both at the Royal Society because they're both.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you now. So there's Stuart's information. If you can keep it relatively
Can you hear me
brief,
okay?
Stuart, that'd be great. Yes, we can.
Yeah, sorry, we were getting some reverb. Okay, I'll just share my slides. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, Shelley,
Yes.
can you see that? Yeah.
I can, perfect, thank you. So you've got about sort of a little bit more like 10 minutes if you can keep it to that. That'd be great.
Yeah. I'll go quickly then. Okay. Well, I think a lot of these concepts have already been introduced. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is some general considerations for the when manipulations of the lighting in the care home environment, and I think generally manipulations for human studies generally. So we know about the different types of image forming and non-image forming responses to light. So I won't go into that in detail. And of course, we have these melanopsin photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which are critically important in these responses. And a key point that actually has been raised already is the fact that photopic lux does not accurately reflect these responses, and this led to the development of this concept of melanopic lux, or melanopic equivalent daylight illuminance, which is now being widely used to actually try and capture the different spectral sensitivity of these non-visual responses to light. And actually using the same sort of system, you can actually calculate for any light source, you can calculate the activity of any retinal photoreceptor, rods or red, green or blue cones. And this is what you refer to as alpha-opic lux, where alpha is the type of photoreceptor you're referring to. So you can apply this to basically all the photoreceptors in the human retina to describe these different responses to light. And working with Manuel Spitzchen a few years ago now, and Forrest Webler, we were discussing this in terms of actually the light environment is actually a lot more complex than we sort of often presume. If you consider a scene like this, you have different areas which have got natural light, you've got artificial light sources, you've got reflected surfaces. So actually, the light environment is more complex than we often give it credit for. And so different areas of visual space will actually have different spectral, a different spectral makeup. And these different parts of the visual scene will fall onto different photoreceptors on the retina, the red, green and blue cones, the melanopsin and the rods. And so actually this, it potentially creates a lot more complexity than we often consider. And of course, much of the laboratory data we have on this is using full field illumination, where the whole visual field is actually exposed, as opposed to the natural light environment under real world conditions, where our eye movements, head movements will actually mean that the light falling across our retina is constantly changing, which may mean that we actually have different contribution of visual photoreceptors too. And whilst this does seem, now there are small spectrophotometer devices whereby we can measure the wavelength of light, shown here at the top, across a whole day, and look at how the spectrum that any one person is exposed to varies. And from that, we can calculate the photopic lux, we can calculate melanopic lux and see how those vary, and even express them as ratios. But one thing we find when you start looking at this is there are many regularities. So people typically spend their time in the same environment, and in a care home environment, as Shada beautifully showed before, actually, you really need to consider areas where people sleep and areas where people don't sleep. And that is probably a very sensible way of capturing that sort of statistical regularity in the environment. But a lot of these changes are really dominated by changes in intensity rather than necessarily large changes in the spectral composition. And based upon a recent expert working group, Tim Brown reanalyzed data from human melatonin suppression, circadian phase shifting, and subjective alertness. And this is largely data from the Harvard lab and from Basel, from Christian Kjokken's group. And you can express these as like a drug dose response curve, where you have a drug dose of, well, where you treat light as a drug, whereby you have the dose on a log scale of melanopic EDI here, and you see basically you go from having no effect, a biological effect, to an increasing effect up to a point of saturation. And based upon this, you can actually try and provide some sort of indication of what the the levels of light, for example, daytime indoors should be around sort of 250 melanopic lux. So you're up here on this curve, and pre-sleep you want to be below sort of 10 melanopic lux, and on a night when you're sleeping below 1 melanopic lux. And this is based upon trying to actually minimize known biological effects. So these responses occur over several log units. And similarly, I mean, this going back to old data from Bud Brainard on melatonin, an action spectrum for melatonin suppression, we can actually see it is possible to get, you see these responses to different wavelengths of light. They all show these dose response curve characteristics. And even with, where the response is more sensitive, this curve is pushed in this direction with blue light. And where it's less sensitive, it's pushed in this direction towards the right. And as a result, you can actually still get responses with red light. You just need more of it. And so all of these responses, we really ought to be considering as these dose response curve kind of responses. Thinking of this, for example, just a quick illustration of the effects of warm versus cool white light. We can calculate the level of alpha-opic lux for each of these pigments. 100 lux, for example, of warm versus cool white light would give us nearly 100 lux of melanopic EDI for the cool white light, but only about 46 for the warm white. So this actually is about a twofold reduction in melanopsin activation. But actually, if you consider that on this scale of the dose response curve scale, we're talking about a difference of that. So actually, this is probably within the error, and to be able to measure a difference like that, we would need a very large sample size to be able to get that resolution, to be able to measure that in practice. So again, it's a 75% versus a 60% response. And so actually changing intensity is also quite important when you're changing correlated color temperatures. Similarly, blue blocking will actually, so this is daylight, typically blue blocking, people cut out below 500 nanometers. It still leaves this whole area of the melanopsin sensitivity curve actually where the is still capable of detecting light and responding to light. And again, on a log dose response curve or a radiance response curve scale, that's a difference of about there to there. So it's not perhaps surprising that, in many studies using blue blocking glasses, these studies show no effect. So about, in patients with individuals with normal sleep, around half of studies show some effect, half of studies show no effect. But one of the key points is you need to know the incident light levels, because if your light levels are up here, reducing those by a small amount won't have any effect. If they're down here, then you may be having no effect anyway. So you need to know what that actual incident light level is as well. Another point on the transmission of blue blocking glasses and blue blocking filters is people often don't report the transmission. Sometimes people typically using below 500 nanometers, some people are actually using at 550 nanometers. That may be expected to have a much greater effect, because actually you're then starting to get up to a 16-fold overall log unit difference in actual light intensity. So, and also one other point just to make in this whole field from recent data, of which the Harvard lab again have been critically involved, along with groups from Monash, is there's a big variability in individuals' responses to light. We don't yet know why, whether these are differences in things like the melanopsin protein, but actually there are big differences between individuals, and that is often not taken into account when studying larger populations. And again, the amount of light required to get a 50% response can vary about 50-fold from 6 lux up to 350 lux. The time of day of the light exposure also is critically important. Light on an exposure on an early night will result in a phase delay. Light response, light exposure later in the night will lead to a phase advance. And our modern light environment, work from Ken Wright, has shown that actually the modern light environment primarily differs from the natural light environment in two ways. We're exposed to less light during the day in the modern artificial light environment, and we're also exposed to this dim light on an evening. And this leads to changes in melatonin, changes in sleep episodes as well. And of course, that's because our exposure to light is typically into the evening. This shows the human phase response curve to light from studies at Harvard, showing that actually, that the timing of light exposure is also critical and should be taken into account in these kind of studies. And finally, just want to really end on some of the points related, of course, critically to aging and the aging population. The non-visual effects of light in aging population can be affected by a huge range of different factors. So lens transmission, shown in this graph here, varies enormously across age from children all the way up to elderly individuals. There's a reduction in the total amount of light transmitted by the lens, and also particularly cut off at shorter wavelengths. There are many other factors as well. So the pupil size is typically smaller with age. There can be changes in chronotype, actually less sleep consolidation, reduced activity levels, and there can also be specific illnesses and medication effects, which may all modify the responses to light interventions. So in terms of going forward, I think just want to emphasize that this visual and non-visual photobiology is a complex and fast-moving field, and many simple lighting solutions that are often recommended may actually produce very small effects unless intensity is also taken into account. Changes in intensity are typically, I say, often greater than the changes in wavelength. And actually taking a quote really from Steve Lockley at Harvard, who Shadab has worked closely with over the years, that you could basically consider that light is a drug, and its effective use depends upon the right dose at the right time in the right context. And I think really as well, we need a better dialogue between basic scientists and lighting engineers to translate these findings really into practice. So with that, I just want to thank my lab and collaborators, thank you for your attention.
So I'm going to now pass over to Kristen from Healrod. I don't know how to say it. She's kindly allowed me to share her slide, so I will do that. And Kristen, if you'd be willing to begin, I will mute myself and share my screen. Here we are.
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you for the introduction. I will start with introducing my residential home, Ålholmhjemmet, which is on the next slide. Ålholmhjemmet reopened after renovation in 2005. The new home have 46 apartments, and 17 of these apartments are 2 rooms, so couples can live together. Right now, we have 2 couples living at our home. The apartments are divided into 6 houses with 7 to 8 apartments in each house. The residentials are all living with dementia. And during the nights, we have 2 employees working. And in the evening, we have 10 employees working at the house. During the day, we have 2 to 3 employees in each house. And then, of course, we have nurses, activity employees, and managers who work at this house. On the next slide, you can see how we got the idea. I had an employee who went to a fair, and she met someone from Chromavisio who we bought the light from. And she was very interested in what he had to tell about the light, and she could see the idea for the people living with the dementia. So we tried to make an application for a pool, but that wasn't a success. So we waited a couple of years, and then we decided that we really wanted this light. And then we detained occupation of a job position and saved some money so we could buy the light. We bought it in 4 steps. We got it, we've got it in the house in 4 steps, and we bought it over 3 budget years. So we saved the money and then bought some and saved the money and bought the next part. The implementation, Well, the 3 steps was for 3 first steps was in the 6 houses and in the corridors, and then after that we decided to have it in the offices too, to be sure that the employees understood the effect of this light. We decided that they were not allowed to change the light for the last 2 months. They should keep their fingers off the control panel, as you see on the slide. It was pretty hard in the beginning, but then they accepted it. And after a while, especially the evening and the night shift, start talking about how fantastic it was with this light. The control panel is pretty easy to work with. There's both a painting and some letters so you can read it. So no matter how good you are at the Danish languages, you can either see it or read how to change the lights. And usually we have it on Circadian light, which I surely prefer, but sometimes we change it. During the night, they sometimes have to change it to full light if something extraordinary happens and they need the lights to handle the situation. Then they of course turn on the light and then turn it back to circadian lights afterwards. We can also change it to activity lights, which also is used once in a while, and then we can turn the lights off if we need to do that. The gains of this for us was we were talking a lot about how to measure the gains, and after 2 months we asked the employees about the light, and they were really happy about it. The day shift said that they had more energy when they went home from work, and they had less headaches, and generally they were in a better mood. We started with the light in the weekend where you shift from summertime to wintertime, so we can see there's a difference between the effect of the light during the summer and the winter. And that was clearly from the start, but to make sure to get all the employees to think that this was a very good idea, we decided to start where we knew that the effect would be the biggest. The evening shift, well, they sleep earlier when they come home from work. Usually some of them had to wait about 2 hours before they could go to sleep. The whole system had to shut a little bit down and then they could go to sleep. But after we got this new light, they reported back that after 1 hour they could already go to sleep, so they thought it was a very good thing. They also experienced fewer conflicts between the residents during the evening and had a better well-being in general. The night shift, they had quieter nights and they also slept earlier after work like the evening shift did. On the next slide, the effects of this was, you can see on the picture how the light looks during the night, and the new light were turned on a Friday, and when I came to work on Monday morning, the night workers were very happy. The residents had been more quiet and sleeping during the weekend than they usually were, and that is what they are supposed to do during the night, so the workers were really happy about that. When the residents came out in the corridors, they turned around and went back to the bed in the apartment instead of getting dressed and looking for breakfast. Usually when they stepped out in the corridors, all the light turned on, bright lights, and they thought it was morning, they wanted to get dressed and they wanted some breakfast. So the light helped them to keep the rhythm 24 hours. We also had an old lady in the evening. She found out that this light were nice, so she went down to the house who had this light and laid down on the couch, and the whole system she calmed down and fell asleep. So when the night shift arrived, they followed her down to her apartment and she slept during the night. So for her, she got more hours of sleep because she could calm down and fall asleep already around 9 or 10 o'clock instead of waiting until the night shift came and it was dark and everything. So she had a better day after that because she was getting better sleep. The nurses, they wanted to work nights in the house where we had this new light, so they started rotating. So before we got it in all the 6 houses, every 3 nights they went to a house where we had this night light, and then they had 2 nights with daylight, and they could feel the difference when they went home in the morning and had to go to sleep, and their well-being were different depending on what night they had been on. after 3 years, the light broke down. We were hit by the lightning, so it broke down. And then the employees then sent me a mail, not a nice mail. They were very upset, and it wasn't okay that they didn't have this light. And that told me that for them, it had been something, it was giving at that point for them that of course they had this light and they had the right to have this light because they were doing the night shift. The challenging thing all this is during the evening employees, they turned on the lights when they had to document. So the light was shifting too much. So we had bright light when they were documenting, and then they went back to the more calm evening light. So we had a talk with them, and they tried working without turning on the bright lights when they documented, and that made a difference for both the employees but also the people living in the house. The residents, they are also in the evening sometimes put to bed too early, so they went to bed before the sun got down, and so they didn't have the real effect of it in the evenings. But during the night, when they then woke up and got out, they had the effect. They are still going to bed a little bit too early, but some of them have the effect and some don't. And then, of course, the control panel, we had to learn the employees that they should keep the fingers away from the panel, because the best light is when it just goes as it's supposed to from the computer and the way we decided it to go. So altogether, we are very happy about the light. And when we get new employees, especially during the evening and the night shift, they, after a few days, they comment on the light because they think it's a better environment to work in for them. So yes, Shelley, that was what I had.
What a fascinating and inspiring chat. It really brings a lot of this to life, because behind all the studies, there are real human beings, and that's fascinating. So at the end of this session, we're now going to move on to Jo Cheshire from WCS Care, who is working, as I think Russell mentioned, with Oxford, and I'm privileged to be part of that team to look at lighting in that context. And then we're going to finish off with a conversation with Michelle Borison from Goodison Health in the States, who's also been looking at using circadian lighting in their space. And then at the end, for those who want to stay, Helen Looms is going to make some brief summary remarks. And then those who want to stay is going to host a conversation between the residential care providers for those who'd like to stay and ask them some additional questions. So now I'd like to pass over to Jo Cheshire, and I'm just going to place your information in the chat so that everybody knows about you, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Shelley. So I'll rattle through, I'll go through some slides quite quickly. Basically, we're a charity. We've got 13 care homes. We're lucky we're all in Warwickshire, so all of our care homes are in quite a small area. So we're known in the UK sector for our innovation. I'll just run through a little bit of why we're so interested in innovation. If you've never seen the video Uninvited Guests, I'm not going to play it, but I would recommend it. It's a fantastic video that talks about all the gadgets and gizmos that people introduce into care homes and other settings to supposedly help residents, but they're often gadgets that can then be put in a drawer or ignored, compared to something like your circadian lighting, which actually is integral to the building and just delivers its impacts continually in the background with nobody having to remember to use it. So we always look at the innovations through the lens of, will it contribute to health, well-being, the impact for staff using something, as much as the impact on residents as well. So a bit about our journey. We've introduced quite a lot of tech into our homes. Acoustic monitoring, which some of you might be familiar with, wasn't used in the UK until we introduced it, which has had a massive impact on reducing nighttime falls in our homes. We use electronic care planning as well. So we're getting thousands of recorded pieces of data every day on our care plans now and our care records. So we're actually inundated with data that can really help us analyse what is going on in the homes. That has a relative gateway that lets our relatives see care in real time as well. Circadian lighting, which we'll obviously talk more about, and then actually the design of our buildings is changing as we're realizing that we can build differently to encourage people to get outside more, be more actively involved in their day-to-day lives. Just because you're living in a care home doesn't mean that actually you can't cook, clean, do all those things that you're used to doing. So we're interested in circadian lighting because of a lot of the impacts of dementia are very similar to lack of sleep. So for those of our residents who have dementia, obviously that lack of sleep then layers on extra behaviours, which then our staff have to manage, and it's not nice for staff, it's not nice for the resident, it's not nice for relatives. So anything that we can do to impact on the health and well-being of our residents is something that we're going to investigate. So there's a video link there for you. I'm not going to play it today because that would take up quite a bit of my speaking slot, but I've put the link in there, and I know Shelley will share this later, but that really explains our bit of our journey so far. So you'll see from the photo that there's one light in this building, which is a beautiful orange. That was our innovation hub where we first installed a demo of circadian lighting when we first started talking about this, probably about 8 years ago now, actually. And we were showing visitors to our innovation hub what circadian lighting's potential was. At the same time, we retrofit a circadian lighting system just into the ground floor and one household in another of our care homes, and did a little bit of a study with Coventry University. So we used the Bradford Dementia Mapping tool for this. And you can see that 1 week before installation, we had 26% of residents who were in a negative mood. The smaller graph there in the middle is after 3 weeks, but after 8 weeks, you can see that actually the mood of our residents had shifted significantly. And the only thing that had changed in this home was the installation of the circadian lighting. This is a home that also uses acoustic monitoring at night, which also does help residents to sleep better. So some of the impacts of these of this installation, quite a bit similar to some of the things that Kirsten was just talking about. Calmer residents, residents could be de-escalated if they were getting upset or were having disagreements. Things that Russell touched on earlier, we've got fewer residents who are nutritionally at risk who live on that household. Generally, they are better orientated, they rarely walk without purpose, and they definitely sleep better. And in fact, the residents who live on this household during COVID came out of isolation better than the residents who live in the other households in this home, which was something that we weren't anticipating. So even our relatives recognised the difference that this was having for their loved ones, and we would have relatives bringing their loved ones who lived on the other floors down into the public area of the home where the lighting is, and they recognised that they had a pleasant visit in the circadian lighting, and often their relative was calmer in that environment. As far as staff goes, they did prefer to complete paperwork in the brighter daylight, but staff slept better once they got home, and they reported reductions in SAD symptoms as well. Definitely improvement staff mood. Chicken and egg, one of those things of because the staff's mood had improved, were they better with the residents and therefore the residents' mood improved, or is it the behaviours in the residents had changed and therefore the carer's job was easier? At the end of the day, there was a significant change for everybody that was quite noticeable. Managers noticed the change in the staff team. All the staff would recommend the installation of the lighting, definitely felt the difference, and actually felt that the process had gone quite smoothly, and they are desperate actually in this home to have it installed across the rest of their households. So in 2019, we opened Woodside Care Village. Woodside is designed as a home based slightly on the model from De Hogebeck, if you've heard of De Hogebeck in the Netherlands. So it has no indoor corridors. All of the corridors are outside. It's designed to encourage people to get outdoors for natural daylight wherever possible, but the home has circadian lighting throughout. There's a case study there of one of our residents who moved from another of our homes into Woodside, settled very, very quickly. His falls reduced. The family noticed a significant difference in him. And actually the son, who was a paramedic, had said that he'd never seen anything like it when he saw the change in his father. So continuing with the theme of outdoor time, the design of our buildings, certainly in the UK, can limit residents getting outside. We heard a stat, unfortunately we can't trace it now, that a lot of residents in care homes only get outside for about 3 minutes a month, which is horrendous, but it's very believable because actually people move into care homes with only slippers and dressing gowns. They don't come with shoes and coats, and actually the barriers to getting outside can be many, from locked doors to staff who are too tied up and busy with other residents. So one of our things that we do is we look at risk very differently, and we keep our doors to the outside open, and we expect residents to be able to go outside freely. They are good at judging their own risk, and often even those residents with dementia. So if you make those spaces accessible, actually encouraging people to get outside is really important. And one of the things we do is have a target. So one of the advantages of having electronic care planning is that we can measure and record how much time people spend outside. So you can see we do our own data gathering, but it can be hard, and that's why we're so pleased to be working with Russell and Stuart and Oxford, and looking at the PhD, because we really want to be gathering better data that will evidence the impact of the lighting. You know, we have stories about the reduction in medication for depression, for example, at Woodside, but it would be really nice to capture a lot more of this in a much more structured way. So progress to date. So this is a picture of Woodside. So you can see the one home has the full circadian lighting. We've got Drover's House that has a third of the lighting, but we actually have another 11 homes that we really want to retrofit lighting into, and that is tricky. One of those is another new build home, but the rest are quite old buildings from the 1950s and 60s, and of course they've got residents and staff in them, so we need to figure out how to retrofit into those buildings in a way that doesn't disrupt the life of those residents. And just to think about the scale and opportunity that there is in the UK, there are nearly 500,000 registered bed spaces, but a lot of these buildings are really old buildings. So what we'd love to do is achieve a model and spec for the lighting which actually makes it really possible and feasible for the UK care sector to adopt this kind of lighting. Because if we're seeing the impacts for residents that we are, the ripple effect, if the industry started to adopt it, would be really quite significant, and linking into reduced hospital admissions, reduced costs, but key is that health and well-being for residents. So what we'd like to achieve, our acoustic monitoring success story is quite interesting. We were the first in the UK to introduce acoustics. We were able to evidence that that had a very big impact on reduction of falls at night and during the day for residents. And we shared our experience of that technology through our innovation hub. It got picked up by the UK regulator, the CQC, and they shared it in a report that they produce every year. And then slowly it started to be noticed by the Department of Health and Social Care and others. And eventually that technology is now being funded through the NHS Transformation Directorate. we would like to see a similar direction of travel for circadian lighting. And then actually, if that funding is made available, it will become a much more expected component potentially of new builds, but also possible for older buildings to retrofit it. And actually, potentially customers will ask for it. We certainly get customers who choose us because of the technology that we use. So here's a photo of one of our older buildings. You can see the beautiful lights in this 1960s building and one of the corridors. So we have done work to improve lux levels in corridors already, and we do see a difference for that. But we do need to be thinking about the lux levels, the energy savings. We don't want to be wiring in, we don't want to be chiseling out walls and disrupting people's lives in these homes. So can we achieve it with a wired or non-wired system? Obviously costs are huge, and then the disruption to residents. So when we started this, the stuff that we wish we'd known, what our technical spec was going to be, we've had fascinating conversations with Oxford, Shelley and John Bullock, who are pulling together all of that spec, and we've learned such a lot about what we actually need to deliver this in the homes. Actually, the difficulty of finding retrofit options that are cost effective, that we would be prepared to invest in, that don't have long ongoing costs associated with them. It took us a while to get academic interest, and we're so thrilled that we have it. And then ultimately, can we link falls or other health and well-being benefits to funding? Because that's hard, and with acoustics, it took us the best part of 7 years for that journey to happen. Having done it once, it will be interesting to see if we can achieve that much quicker. Thank you.
Oh my word, another inspiring story. Thank you so much. It's yeah, fabulous, and what a privilege to be working with you. And the points you make are all so well made, including the ones at the end about retrofit, about this needing to be affordable and actually a no-brainer across the sector. It's a privilege to introduce our third and final case study from Michelle Borison from Goodness Health in the States. She's going to share a little bit about the work she's been doing with, I believe, Rod Heller, who's also on the call. So I shall ask you, Michelle, if you're still here. There you are. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to pop that in the chat.
So I have two old buildings that this building was built in the 1950s, and my other building was built in the 1940s. So we retrofitted in our buildings, and so I think it's good that I'm following up Joe to just kind of show you how we did that in our buildings. So my first building is Tweeton Lutheran Healthcare Center. It's a rural 50-bed skilled nursing facility, and it has 2 units. It has a 38-bed unit and a 12-bed dementia unit, and we're in Spring Grove, Minnesota. Our installation date for the lighting that we did here was in April of 2017. And this is my other building, Gunderson Harmony Care Center. Again, rural building, 43-bed skilled nursing facility. Both of these buildings were like the hospitals in our towns, if you will, the small hospitals, and then those closed, and we continued on with a skilled nursing facility. So it's the corridors, such as Joe was speaking to, and we just worked with what we had and retrofitted. So this is just our previous lighting system. The lighting was that traditional fluorescent, was a variety of colors, ranging from that 3500 to 4100K. As you can kind of see, even the different colors in this picture. And we moved to that LED lighting, and we tried to support that circadian rhythm. And you can kind of see, as we have throughout the day, different times where the lighting will adjust. So it kind of gets brighter as the day goes on, and then gets brings in that orange light as the day progresses, to support that circadian rhythm. So this kind of just shows you you see a little bit more blue light in that daytime spectrum, and then as we get into evenings, we were bringing in a little bit more of that orange light. So you can kind of see how we had that set up. This is just some before and after pictures of, we did put in a lower ceiling and we put in some new lights. How I helped fund it is I had written a grant to help fund this, and so that helped support the cost of that. We're able to get the lights retrofitted that way. So our lighting and controls, they were off the shelf, nothing custom. And I think at the beginning too, in my first building, so at Tweeton, when we installed in 2017, we did have some challenges at first, as staff did want to turn on the lights like in the mornings, like when it was still dark outside and they were trying to do their charting, or at night. But we answered by putting lamps at the nurse's desk and at the med carts, and that was effective. And then this time, we've been in this now since 17. So by 6 years later, my staff don't really touch the controls at all. And then when we installed in 2020 in Harmony, we already knew that we were going to have to maybe have, lamps at the nurse's desk and at the med carts. And so they didn't want to even go to the controls. So they leave the controls alone and they just let it run on the control system, and it works very, very well. So these were the initial results at Tweeton. After installing in 2017, we did see about a 32% reduction in falls. We went from 9.12 falls per resident day to 6.17. We also saw a reduction in anti-anxiety use from 1.99 to 1.84 per 1,000 resident days. And then we saw some reduction in our antipsychotic use as well, on our dementia unit from 1 to 0.92 per 1,000 resident days. And some initial results in our Harmony building, we saw a reduction in anti-anxiety use from 3.28 to 3.13 per 1,000 resident days. As far as antidepressant use, we went down from 5.47 to 5.3 per 1,000 resident days. And then our antipsychotic use dropped as well from 1.66 to 1.18 per 1,000 resident days. And, in Harmony, we finished our installation right before COVID. And then, this is throughout COVID as well, when we had to go into lockdown and our residents couldn't see our families there for a time as well, in person. Of course, we saw nice results in our decrease in our electricity cost. So at Tweeton, we saw a $3,000 savings per year, and in Harmony, $4,000 savings per year in our electricity costs. And our residents are definitely sleeping better for sure. We're seeing less hypnotic use, and our residents are getting better sleep. So that was a good thing to see as well. We really feel that the color settings made the difference. We didn't really change the luminance, but based on our IRB approved study, it was definitely the color settings, I would say. And that is my presentation. So, any questions?
Thank you, Michelle. That was just fascinating. Can I just you went through those last few really fast. Do you want to just go back to that what made a difference point? Would you be willing to do that?
Sure.
Thank you. So you mentioned that it was the color settings, it was the amount of blue in the light source. That's my understanding, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Great, good, thanks very much. We've got a few minutes. Helen Looms, who is the president-elect of the Society of Light and Lighting, is going to offer some remarks from what she's picked up in the course of this, because I've been so busy monitoring the chat stuff. And then for those who'd like to stay, we're going to, she's kindly going to sort of chair a conversation between Michelle and Kristen and Joe, if Michelle can stay on as well. And anyone who wants to sort of ask some more practical questions about these things. And all the recording up to that debate will be uploaded and shared with you in the next few days. So Helen, over to you.
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you to all of the presenters. It's been a very fascinating couple of hours. I'm really thrilled to see this combination of academic research and then the practical hands-on case studies. And I know, Joe, you feel as though things are taking a long time, but from my point of view, from having seen your work in, before COVID, well before COVID, and seeing where you are now, I think we're making progress. It could be much quicker, certainly, and it would be good to see even more progress and speeding it up. But what I'm really taking home from this is such positive results. It's good to see that everything that we hoped would happen really is paying dividends, and we're getting happier residents, happier staff and relatives. But I think what's also interesting is that is the measurement of falls, because they are very, very easy to measure. It's much harder to measure mood and anxiety and things like this. You are definitely getting results on those, but the falls is such an easy thing to measure, and the results are very, very dramatic. So I'm really pleased to see all of this work happening. It's good to see that Kirsten in Denmark has got similar results, and of course with Michelle in the States. So yeah, I think the big question is, as Joe also mentioned, how do we move this forward? How do we get the funding? And how do we put pressure on some of the authorities to really push this forward for all of our care homes? It would be wonderful if all of our elderly residents had this kind of environment to live in. I think, as Shelley said, my name's also down for WCS when I'm a bit older as well. That's where I'm going to go. But yeah, for me, I would just like to really reiterate what a great, interesting afternoon it is. I don't want this to stop here. We really must keep all of this work, the conversation and the collaboration moving forward. And this is something that the Society of Light and Lighting are more than happy to facilitate and would really love to see happening more of it.
Great, thank you so much. That was a great summing up. So this is the end of the sort of formal presentations. Now we're going to some specific questions to our healthcare providers who have kindly shared so much fascinating information about what it's like on the ground, complementing the information from the scientists. So we've had an interesting question from Lee. Helen, if Kirsten and Joe and Michelle, if you're able to stay on, would like to just put your cameras on. Thank you so much. So Lee has asked a question, and then I'm going to hand over to you, Helen, if you can continue to moderate. So Lee asked a question. I'm interested to know about how much lighting installation costs from Joe, And actually it'd be interesting to know from the others as well, because we've got an international audience with us. And if any talks have been held with NHS Transformation Directorate on funding. So Joe, would you like to just field that one, and then we'll ask the other team members, because I think there are some interesting questions about funding both in Denmark, because that's a municipal property, and also in the States, where I understand there's the potential even to get insurance, so as in insurance reimbursements. Over to you, Joe. Thank you.
So cost-wise, off the top of my head, I don't have the exact figure for the installation at Woodside. I know that it was roughly £60,000 to £80,000 above the cost of a standard lighting for a new build home, and we were lucky enough actually to attract a grant for that from a local charity who funded that difference for us. I think the perspective that we take is, can we sell one extra bed for 1 year because of having that technology in the home? And the answer is yes. And if you think that a home like Woodside will be around for 40, 50 years, and that lighting system is going to be in there supporting all of the residents that it will over that time, then actually we're definitely going to be able to recoup those costs through sales, because people do know that it makes a difference, so they choose us based on that.
I think also that cost of this type of technology must start to come down soon.
Yeah.
And if you're doing a new build, the add-on price won't be as high as it was in the past. You know,
yeah.
It's definitely got to even itself out.
Yeah, and at the moment, as far as the funding through the digital transformation, the funding that the technology that they're supporting through that funding at the moment is very much focused on acoustics and electronic care planning. They've not got so far yet as to be thinking about things like circadian lighting, because the whole of the care sector is not yet digitally enabled, and the fact that there's still care homes that are using paper-based care records is something that they obviously want to move forwards, so that everybody can connect now that we're in a much more electronically connected world, I think.
Do you think that also with the cost of energy, there might also be some savings from your energy consumption, because you are dimming the lights so much more in the evenings? Yes,
potentially, and that's one of the things that we've not truly explored. Obviously, it was a new build home. I think I've just seen a question pop up. It's a 72-bed home, is Woodside. It's 12 households of between 5 and 7 residents. It's built around a family size model. So I'm not sure what we're seeing, because we demolished an older home on that site and built that new site, so we've not got direct cost comparisons.
Yeah,
thank you. Sorry, I just was wondering if Kirsten and Michelle could respond. Sorry, yeah. Helen, I'll shut up.
Kirsten, what's your experience with the costs?
Well, I tried to take my calculator and figure out how much the Danish kroner was in euro, and it's about 200,000 we paid when we bought it. Okay. I think it was in 2016 we bought it, and it's a lot of money, but it's worth it. When all the employees have a better well-being, they have less illness, and then slowly, yeah, you have not a profit of it, but you can save the money, if you understand what I mean. Yeah, and I can't in Denmark, I can't see in this community we can't see if I'm saving money on the electricity, because the electricity is not in my budget. It's in another budget some other people are taking care of.
And do you see that there's a possibility of more care homes installing this type of lighting because of your experience?
Yes, I do. We have talked about it several times. We have 6 homes like this in this community, and one of them is right now doing some experience with this light at their house with Kromavise, who was the one delivering the light here. So right now we are 2 working with the light, and they are, yeah. I can't say, I don't know exactly what they are working on, but I just know she has the light and she's very happy about it.
Good. So maybe we can have some more case studies in the
Oh,
future.
yes. Yep.
Wonderful. And Michelle, how about you? What's your financial experience?
Yeah. So at my first nursing home, the cost was about 129,000 back in 17, and then at the second one it was 151,000. And so really I look too at like our cost of care overall. You know, if we're decreasing the use of meds, decreasing falls, and keeping them out of the hospital from those falls, I looked at, you know, I think that has to be considered as well. And so that was something that I really looked at in helping decrease that that hospital stay as well.
Yeah.
So, and our
So
cost of care overall.
I think we've got a common consensus that, you know, it is a very effective, cost-effective way of doing things, but somehow we've got to provide the investors with this evidence so that they will back future projects and see where we can go to in the future. And I did see that, I think it was Rod Heller was trying to say something there. Rod, did you have a comment or a question? No. Okay.
Okay. I just done. There we go. Yeah, I worked with Michelle on the installation for her facilities, and then we've got more that we have done with Dr. Rahman. And we figure right now it's about $2,500 per room. But that also includes the common areas. It includes the dining area, the activity rooms, etc. But as a rough number, that's about what it is. And we're hoping that we can bring that cost down as what do I want to say? As the cost of LED chips come down, and then also as the control system costs, because we're working on creating an open protocol system to make everything as ubiquitous as possible, because there's really no reason to have proprietary lighting or controls in a healthcare environment. It should be all commercial grade.
Yeah, sure. And I think the development of the control systems and the lighting systems themselves are becoming a lot more interreplaceable. You know, things will work off common systems much more than they did when Joe was looking at this 7-9 years ago. Which brings me on to another question that's in the chat. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, there is one thing that's coming down the pipeline for everybody in the care home business, okay? And that is the number of electronic medical devices. There are so many that are coming down the pipeline that everybody's going to have to be sharing access to the internet. And every time you have an access point to the internet, you got the potential for cyber attacks, okay? Mm-hmm. This is a problem that we have to solve. We're working on it, but everybody, because I don't know any care homes that have IT staff members. It's just not in the budget, right? So you have to have security. We're working with a software company that has that security. We're testing things out, but when you're sensing for falls, you're sensing for incontinence, you're sensing for temperature, heart rate, etc. And it's all electronic, okay? Because we don't have the staff to do this on a timely basis. All of those sensors, like you say, they need internet access, and it's got potential for problems. And this is something that everybody that's out there in the lighting world has to understand, that you're just a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, we do get sort of a bit obsessed with our own area, don't we? And think
Right.
It's the only thing that's going to work. Yeah, I get that. There are certainly systems coming along that don't need internet access. So that might even become more popular as we move forward. If you're using less data, you're not having to compromise security systems. So a more localized system might be something that's more beneficial. But we've got another question here from Dawn Brown, who's asked, how do you manage increased light levels in retrofit without the fixtures becoming too glary? So I think this is one part of a question about retrofit. If you are using existing fittings and you're just replacing the light source, yes, you've got to consider the glare from the luminaire, but most often you're replacing the whole luminaire itself. So in that case, you can address any glare issues that might be caused from having possibly a slightly brighter source, but more often it's usually spread over a larger surface area, so it's not so glary. And we've also got this possibility of dimming as well. But it is interesting to see if we can retrofit existing luminaires, because we are all now much more aware of the sustainability angle, retrofitting, reusing anything that's got any embodied carbon. And if we can reuse something but make it suitable for purpose, that's another great advantage. So Joe, when you're talking about retrofits, I know we years ago talked about one where you were concerned you might even have asbestos. So this was, you really had to touch almost nothing. And you've got 11 care homes that you're wanting to look at. Do you have an approach for retrofitting that you're moving towards?
Well, we've been lucky working with Shelley and John Bullock, who is a lighting consultant here. And John has been doing a piece of work reaching out to manufacturers and suppliers from not just the UK, but around the world to see what is now available, because as you say, technology is moving incredibly quickly in this area, and there's new things coming to market all of the time. And we're actually meeting John in just a couple of weeks' time to get a roundup of everything that he's learned over the last 2 or 3 months, pulling all of that together for us. So I've not got an answer just yet, but we're hoping that we're very close. Yeah, and then touch wood, we'll be starting the work with Oxford University, doing some pre-work in the homes to get some before the lights go in benchmark data. And then we're going to retrofit into a home and let our student go back in and do what she needs to do. And we'll just see what we're getting. But she's got a good number of care homes to work across. So we're hoping that across the group, with the different options that we've got, that she's going to have a really good spread of both residents and environments to work with to gather data from.
Brilliant. What's the period of time for her study?
It's a 3-year PhD, just started in October. So she's at that early stage, and unfortunately we've got to get NHS ethical approval. And yes, yeah, that's potentially going to slow her down a little bit. But we're figuring out other things in the meantime while she works on that.
Brilliant. And Michelle, yours were actually retrofit projects, weren't they? Oh, your microphone's on mute.
We in the bedrooms, we retrofitted the lights. So we replaced the light bulbs with LED. So the top light was the blue light, and then the bottom light was more the orange light. And that seems to work well. And staff do have to manually adjust those. So in the morning, they use the blue light on top, and then at night they have to use the orange light. But in the hallways, we were able to replace our old lights with new lights in the majority of the hallway space. So that worked out good.
I think that's a really good, very simple system. If you've got general daytime lighting, which is the cooler, more intense lighting, and then in the evenings, just like you do at home, you might switch to table lamps that are lower down, lower intensity, and warmer colors, you're actually achieving the same sort of effect, maybe not quite so scientifically, but you will have the same positive effects on the residents just by doing something as simple as that. It's not unusual to find care homes with two sorts of lighting, with table lamps and things, because it makes it more homely and more friendly. And that's what people like to see. We all like to see our evening lighting coming down, more intimate, and why not change those, the bulbs within those luminaires into warmer, lower intensity ones. It's very, very easy to do, isn't it?
Yes.
But yeah, to do a fully automated system, you probably do have to change the luminaires. Kirsten, how about you? Is there anything that you want to do in the future from a retrofit point of view?
Well, we changed all the lamps when we got the new light, so it was all new, but we only have it in 4 rooms, 4 apartments.
Okay.
So maybe we should get some light, at least in the bathrooms, at the other apartments, because if we have it in the bathrooms, you can have the orange light and they can find their way out to the toilet when they wake up. So, but that's, yeah, everything costs.
I think the bathrooms are a really good case in point, because if you wake up in the middle of the night, you don't want high intensity blue light. I think if you wake up in the morning and you want to clean your teeth, where you perhaps would want bright light, maybe you can provide that in the living space and keep the bathroom as this warmer, lower intensity. But if you can have the choice of having both in the bathroom, brilliant. But if you have to make a choice, I would go with the warmer light so that it has less detrimental effect during the night time.
Yeah, and many of the people living with dementia, they can't find their way out to the bathroom if it's just all dark.
Yes, yes.
So that would be nice.
I think the Manchester group said that if you can't avoid light in the middle of the night, you have to make sure it's warm light and below 10 lux. So, you know, that's not too difficult to achieve. Yeah. Right. Have you got any more interesting questions there, Shelley, that I haven't had a chance to look at yet?
I think we might actually wrap up. I think there's some really great information in the chat there. But what we might just do is ask each of our speakers that are still on the call to just make any final comments, and then we'll wrap up, I think. Is that okay for you? Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Thank you so much for hosting that. Kirsten, do you have any final things that you'd like other people in the room, lighting manufacturers, lighting specifiers, and others to think about? What would you say? One last sentence.
Well, I can only say it has been worth it. It has been expensive, and sometimes it has been a lot of work getting the employees to figure out how to work with this, but it's worth it because the benefits are there.
Thank you. Joe?
I think I would just second that. We know it works, we know it has an impact, and the sooner we can get it into the rest of the homes, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. And Michelle, do you want to just, our transatlantic guest?
Yes, I agree with both Joe and Kirsten that it is totally worth it, and our residents deserve it. And I think we all deserve it as we get older too, and have to move into a nursing facility, and we'll need that in the future. And so definitely worth it.
Thank you. And Helen, final thought, and then we'll wrap up with thanks to everybody who's been involved, to our sponsors, to BIOS, Glamox, Teben, everybody else who's been involved. Yeah, too many to name. Helen, last thought, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to hear all this positive news. We've been working around the edges of it for such a long time now. It would be great to see a big impact, and I think you guys are at the beginning of this impact. So yeah, thank you for your faith, and let's hope that we can really see some big differences coming up soon. And I'd like to also thank everybody else for joining us, for listening, and I'm sure Shelley will share all of this information with us, including any of the questions that we might not have been able to answer, and we'll see if we can get you an answer of some type. electronically. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Brendan, for working so hard behind the scenes. And yeah, all right. Until we meet again. Thank you again. All right. Bye now. Thank you, guys. That was great.